So this should be the microphone. Is everybody able to hear me? Well, good. So, coming over a little bit here. Maybe I should say 2 more sentences about myself. I'm German, and so it's my first talk at an English university, a venue or what? Welsh. Oh, sorry. Okay. Welsh University. So I'm a meditation teacher, Buddhist meditation teacher, and I wrote a book about 10 years ago. It was published, 2008, where I was researching into the female ancestry in Buddhism. And, well, unfortunately it's not been translated into English or Welsh. But there are, in the last couple of years, maybe 15 years, a lot of research has been done, and I've produced a reading list, so whoever wants to maybe find out more after this talk, you could make a photo of the reading list that we're going to display at the end of the talk, and maybe, find some more details out for yourself. And I'm also a student of Lama Shenpen. She's my Buddhist teacher. And and I will come to that at the end of my talk, introducing some of the Buddhist women that are pioneers in taking their place in Buddhism in the West. So, women in Buddhism. It's interesting why that is a topic at all. If you think about it, I mean, if we would have had a title like Men in Buddhism, you would be a little bit puzzled. Why? That's not the topic. But women in Buddhism seems to be a topic. We feel it is a topic to talk about women in Buddhism because it is apparently not self-evident what their position in Buddhism would be. So we have a question mark. We wonder, how do they do? In other words, we assume that the default position of the Buddhist religious system is that it is male-oriented, or male-biased, or even male-dominated. I will be talking tonight about Buddhism because that's what I know most about. But my guess is that you may find that some points that I will raise will apply or relate to other religions, religious systems just as well. And maybe, after the talk we could talk about that a little bit. Buddhism as a general term or umbrella for whatever is going on in the Buddhist world, that is a very wide-ranged term. Throughout its long history, Buddhism has crossed many cultural frontiers and taken on forms distinctive to each culture. Think alone of all the different countries and societies that have adopted Buddhist practice and views over the last 2,000 years and more, like Japan, Thailand, China, and Tibet, for instance. They all look very distinctly different and have different kinds of aesthetics and so on. So I will need to talk about Buddhism in a quite generalized way for this hour because we have also this other part of the topic, the women And we want to find out how the women are doing in Buddhism. And to ask about the women in Buddhism is also a very broad subject. So tonight I will only be able to give you an appetizer, kind of teaser. But as a basis, we are asking about the women in Buddhism. So how could I say what Buddhism is in one sentence, to give you a kind of feeling of the backdrop against which we are talking here about women. In essence, we could say it is the path that the Buddha discovered, or as he said himself, rediscovered, about 2,500 years ago, a path of meditation and insight. And its goal is the complete removal of suffering, of fear. Or, said the other way around, its goal is the deliverance of the heart. So, we could take this as a kind of backdrop for the discussion around the question how women were able to relate to that in the past 2,500 years and fulfill this goal. I said that we assume that Buddhism is in general a male-biased system, as it is expressed in the societies that have adopted it. And what do I mean by that male-biased system? We could say that the ways to train in order to reach the goal of the deliverance of the heart had been designed mostly by men for other men to be trained. And the hierarchical system was then laid out in such a way as to preserve and further this kind of training system. We could say women hadn't been allowed into the club fully for whatever kinds of reasons. I mean, there was a tendency to think that women were not good enough, lacked something, and sometimes one goes into the discussion a little bit deeper and looks at the reasons. It's rather ridiculous. More often than not, women were also seen not as essential for the uphold and cultivation of the wisdom path of Buddhism, which makes sense when you look from the point of view of a man in a patriarchal society, like it was in India, in China, in Japan, in Tibet. So women were, in addition to that they were not seen as essential to hold up this path of liberation. In addition to that, they were also put down and demonized. Also quite understandable from the point of view of a male monasticism. That was one of the main features of Buddhism. So they were often marked as obstacles or even dangers to the male trainee, or as we say, the practitioner of the path. A practitioner in Buddhist terms is somebody who practices this path of meditation and insight. Following on from that, women were mostly not given access to the higher teachings, to deepening studies. Their desire to lead the life of a renunciate was not prioritized or promoted by their families or the society in general. And their life stories, when one can read something about the female ancestors in Buddhism, they're full of the dramas of being married off and not wanting to be married off, or trying to escape a horrible marriage or something like that. So accordingly, they didn't get a place in the spiritual hierarchy. And many nuns, even nowadays, get less well sponsored than monks. And full ordination is mostly not possible for them. So they stay novices their whole lives, and that again lessens their status in the spiritual hierarchy. Women in Buddhism were often quite invisible. And this fact, for some of them, for some of the practitioners, was also a blessing, because they could disappear. Nobody really noticed what they were doing. So they could do something, they could do their practice and not be under the scrutinization of the society. But that women are invisible or become invisible, I think we know this from our own society. Could sound familiar to us. And I remember that when we asked lamas where the Lama is a honorary title for a teacher, a Tibetan teacher, where the women teachers were, then they said, okay, yes, we have got people, women who are teaching, but they don't like to come out. They like to stay hidden. I began to look for role models from Buddhist history to back up my own spiritual quest or path back in the 1990s. And there seemed only to be 3 or 4 stories of Buddhist women around or be told. And records of female adepts were not readily available. On the other hand, whole convolutes of stories about highly esteemed male adepts were readily available. It's not that I didn't like those stories about the male practitioners, but somehow it made me feel lonely. Like as if when I looked behind me, there was a big hole, a big nothing, and it made me feel sad. But then I saw something. I saw her. And it was right there in the open. And what is that? That is a female Buddha. Buddha is the highest ideal in the Buddhist world, the awakened one, the highest evolvement of a person. And they had it in female. And you can very clearly see that it is a female figure. This is the image of Buddha Tara, a highly revered Buddhist figure. And almost every monastery, Tibetan monastery, does practice to Buddha Tara. I saw her image in one of the Buddhist centers I frequented at that time, and wanted to find out more about her. Then I heard her story. Her story, how she became to be a Buddha. And it's really fantastic how a story like this has been transmitted over the centuries. It goes like this. There was a young princess with the name Yeshe Dawa in Tibetan, which means moon of intuitive awareness. And it is said that she had been practicing the Buddhist path arduously for many lives, and especially infinite compassion. And by this she reached a certain high level of attainment. And as this got round on the spiritual grapevine, the wise monks of the country came to her and suggested she should pray to be reborn as a male to make further progress. Well, at this point, Yeshidawa lets the monks know in no uncertain terms that it is only weak-minded worldlings who see gender as a barrier to attaining enlightenment. She sadly notes then that there have been few who wish to work for the welfare of sentient beings in a female form. So she vowed, "I have developed infinite compassion as a woman. For all my lifetimes along the path, I vow to be born as a woman. And when I attain Buddhahood, then too I will be a woman." And so she did. This story was declared a feminist movement in Buddhism by the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama, the head of, the head of the Buddhist world. Many people know about him. I still feel moved whenever I recall her story by the fact that this kind of a story had been transmitted and kept alive by the Tibetan Buddhist tradition over all these centuries. And the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is, by all means, evolved in a clearly male-dominated society. So that's maybe a sign for the power of this story. But I was wondering, was it really a revolutionary move from Tara's side? Her amazing story was, as I discovered, fully in accord with what the Buddha originally had taught. But prejudice and bias had augmented since then, and presumably the old habit of producing a view in which women couldn't attain enlightenment in their female bodies. Enlightenment as being the highest evolution or evolvement of a person in Buddhism, when all fear and suffering is removed. So what did the Buddha teach? He taught that we can find liberation within this very body that we are now. And that must include the gender we are in now. This specific form that I am now. And it is quite interesting to note that we have a very clear and affirmative answer by the Buddha himself concerning the question if women were capable to fully awaken. So how was this affirmative given? The story of the how and when has been recorded in what is called the Therigatha. Those are 73 poems by the early nuns and lay followers, female lay followers, who lived at the same time as the Buddha did. That is roughly 2,500 years ago. And in this collection of what is called the Songs of Liberation, liberation from suffering, the deliverance of the heart, these songs were sung by the Theris, the women who had grown wise on the path. And here we find the story of Prajapati. She was the foster mother of the Buddha. And it is told that she asked the Buddha for permission to establish a nun's order following in the footsteps of the Buddha, parallel to the newly established monk's order. For 3 times she asked him, and 3 times the Buddha refused her. I won't go into the why and so on because it's ridiculous. But this woman, Prajapati, she wouldn't take a no, even after 3 times. So, together with 500 other determined women who wanted to enter the religious life, she walked to where the Buddha was staying, and they had already shaven their heads and put on the yellow cloth of the order. And this impressive group of 500 women went up to the place where Buddha was staying, and she asked again, a fourth time. So this time she went through Ananda. He was the assistant of the Buddha, his attendant, and Ananda said, okay, let me do it, maybe that's better. So he went in and he asked the Buddha, dear Buddha, I can't understand, why are you refusing them to have a nun's order? Can't a woman reach full enlightenment? Is that the reason? And then the Buddha said, but yes, quite naturally she can. Yes, she can. So this was the answer, and that was a breakthrough, and the women's order was established. And many women started to follow Mahaprajapati on the path of the Buddha in his lifetime. Maybe you could show the next tava. Oh no, this is wrong. The next tava. Okay, good. Then go back to the first one. Okay. Good. Okay. So you've seen the end already. So these women were acknowledged in their status as true followers of the Buddha, who give their lives to this path of liberation. And in their stories, in the collection of their stories, 2,500 years old, wow. We hear about the lives of those nuns, how they gained liberation, what their problems were. We also hear about lay women who followed the path, and forest renunciates, so ascetics who lived in the forests, women, alone. And they talk about the joy of living alone and practicing the path. There's a woman called Sumangala's mother, and she sings, as I destroyed anger and attachment, I was reminded of the sound of bamboo being split. I got to the foot of a tree and think, happiness. And from within that happiness, I begin to meditate. Another one called Rohini seems to have had an ongoing discussion with her father, who is quite skeptical about those contemplatives and his daughter's fascination for them. And he says to her, well, you go to sleep saying contemplatives, you wake up contemplatives, you praise only contemplatives, no doubt you will become a contemplative. Now, Rohini, I ask you, why do you hold contemplatives dear? They don't like to work, they are lazy, living off what's given by others when they are collecting alms. And the daughter replies, for a long time, Father, you've quizzed me about contemplatives. I praise to you their discernment, virtue, endeavor. They do like to work, they are not lazy, they do the best work, they abandon passion and anger. That's why I hold contemplatives dear. In the end, she convinces him to take on the Buddhist precepts too, like her, and become a follower himself. Then there's Bada. She was a follower of the Jains, a pre-Buddhist school of ascetics, and she now tours the country seeking for knowledge among others. She would stick a rose apple bow into a heap of sand as a sign that she would debate with anyone who would debate with her. And she always won. Then one time she met one of the master disciples of the Buddha and was intrigued, and then became a follower of the Buddha. Later proclaiming with no false modesty that her spiritual attainments on the Buddhist path that followed from that were just as good as those of the Buddha's male master disciples, specifically Kassapa. So we don't get submissiveness from these women, do we? I mean, we get a very kind of a confident attitude here. And I would like to draw your attention to a very interesting aspect. In quite a number of these poems, the women talk highly about the importance of finding another woman, a woman they could trust, a woman who showed them the way. For instance, a lady called Uttama says, "It was 25 years since I left home," so since she entered the order, "and I haven't had a moment's peace. Uneasy at heart, steeped in longing for pleasure, I held out my arms and cried as I entered the monastery. But I went up to a nun I thought I could trust. She taught me the Dharma, the Buddhist wisdom path." And another one, Chanda, said, "Compassionate, she showed me the way. Then, having exhorted me, she urged me on towards the highest goal. Her efforts were not in vain. I am free from all hindrances." For these women, an orientation towards a role model in their own sex seems to have been of major impact. Plus, relating to her in trust and confidence. And this is, to my mind, a very important motif that also comes up again and again in discussions with women in Buddhism that I have today. How relating to a female teacher might further confidence. How feeling we can trust another woman we might learn from influences the ability to learn. Following from that, female teachers emerged right in the lifetime of the Buddha, one of them Dhammadinna, who answered the questions put to her by her former husband in such a way that the Buddha proclaimed, "Dhammadinna, the nun, is wise, a woman of great discernment. If you had asked me those things, I would have answered you in the same way she did." This clearly states that what the Buddha declares by this is that Dhammadinna is a teacher equivalent to himself, just as good as the Buddha. And she was not the only one who got this predicate. But interestingly enough, this knowledge and acknowledgement of women as being as proficient as the Buddha succumbed to the strong tendency to be forgotten over the centuries. Still, there were powerful re-emergings, like the figure of Queen Srimala, about 300 in the common area. It seems to have been a time when in certain Indian regions the women of high status had already embraced Buddhism while their husbands tended to remain Hindu. So it is maybe no wonder that a powerful figure like the Queen Srimala emerged. One could say she stands in a direct line with the teacher Dhammadinna, as we shall see. Srimala, having heard that the Buddha was in the world, called upon him to show himself to her out of compassion, and he came. Then, after praising him, she said to the Buddha that she would like to speak to him about how she understood the deepest points of the Dharma, the Buddhist truth. And the Buddha agreed that she could speak with assurance. So she expounded to him her understanding, and it's called her lion's roar. That's a very powerful image, isn't it? Having heard her saying what she wanted to say, the Buddha ascertains that she understood much better than most of his other disciples, and he praises her to be a protectress of the truth. So he, the Buddha, goes away to teach what she expounded to his monks. That's fantastic, isn't it? We have many more evidence in the sutras of this later time highlighting female teachers and accomplished women. But the flourishing of those women was mostly outside the institutionalized Buddhist system, consisting mainly of huge all-male monasteries and universities. I mean, women weren't allowed in the club. This is demonstrated nicely in the story about Saraha. We are now in the 8th century of the Common Era. He was a monk and abbot and a scholar, and at some point in his career he got a hint that he would meet a highly accomplished teacher on the marketplace. Going there, he immediately saw that the person he was looking for was a woman, a female arrow maker. Then he walked up to her and addressed her in a rather condescending way, and he got an answer that made him disrobe and enter apprenticeship with her. Eventually he fully awakened and wrote many verses that have been rated highly in the Buddhist world. I would like to highlight 2 points here. First, this remarkable female teacher was not a nun. She apparently was a lay woman, and she used her handicraft, the arrow making, as a means of awakening. Secondly, she appears in the life story of Saraha, but only in his life stories. She doesn't have a story of her own. And in some versions, she's only a footnote, even though she was that crucial to his awakening. We know nothing about her background, where she learned what she knew and practiced, and the story even doesn't give her name. Although Saraha means arrow maker, and it seems obvious that he took on the name of her craft. So that's in many ways typical to what happened and still happened and still happens to stories about women. Gender attitudes have been contested in Buddhism throughout. It is not a completely new development of the 20th century. The stories, sutras, are full of comments that undercut or even ridicule Buddhist misogyny and male dominance. Here I would like to make a jump from the Indian continent to Japan and demonstrate this with a pithy Zen story. I talked earlier about the tendency to demonize the erotic power of women in an all-male monastic context. So this story gives a little bit of a demonstration of that. In this story, a woman called Eshun, we are now in the 14th century, studies and trains in a monastery alongside monks. And one of them can't stop thinking of sex and invites her to a clandestine meeting, telling her through a letter that having sex with each other was really nothing to be ashamed of. Next morning, when all the monks are seated in the meditation hall, in comes Eshun, stark naked. She walks over to the chap and says, "Well, here I am, come on, let's do it now. Didn't you say it was nothing to be ashamed of?" He left the monastery never to come back. Then we have another story from the Zen tradition, which is a little bit more tragic. It pinpoints something else. We are now in the 18th century, and it's the time of the samurai, all-male heroic thing. It's about a woman called Ryonen, and she's refused by the abbot of her chosen monastery to enter for reasons of her being too beautiful and therefore distracting for his male students. She goes away and burns her face with a hot iron and returns the next day. It is said that the abbot and all the monks were both ashamed and awed by her determination, and they took her in. Back to Europe, Germany. When in the 1990s I started to research into female Buddhist ancestors, I had a hunch that there was more to be discovered beyond the wonderful story of Tara. And I was not alone. Women who were training to be amongst the first female Zen teachers in America found that they were dismayed by having to chant the lineage of the patriarchs in their training and finding not a single woman in them. And they took up research too. Others, like Lama Shenpen Hookham, an American Buddhist teacher, had already published their findings from the Tibetan tradition in the late 1980s in the book Women of Wisdom. But how to find information about women in a male-biased system where the stories of women don't count, where women practitioners remain mostly hidden, their names not recorded? Their stories have to be teased out of what are often the footnotes of stories about their male colleagues, as we have seen with the story about Saraha. In a footnote or a half sentence we might hear of a woman that did, for instance, bring about a major insight for the male yogi, but she's only called a lady, even though it might be apparent that her insight and wisdom is far greater than his. Well, the story is not about her. So within the logic of feminist research methods, we could ask, but what if the story were about her? What would it tell us about her? What could we know or presume? What could we conclude from the clues we have, taking into account other similar stories and the whole background of the where and when it all happened? I think sometimes it is as if one were a restorer of frail remnants of a rare ancient tapestry. We have a piece here and another there. If you looked at these pieces separately, you might come to the conclusion that it was only a very small carpet with no greater importance. But when you look at them from a wider perspective, you might intuit how the pieces were originally linked, how many more there must have been, forming an intricate and widely interwoven grand design. In the same way, we could propose that were we to find records of one woman who, by whatever reason or chance, found her way into the annals and records and whose wisdom was transmitted and maybe even called by her name, that wherever that has happened, she was not alone and isolated. She must have emerged from a context, from a group of women who were practicing training and thinking in the same way as her. It always takes a context to produce an outstanding one. By arguing thus, we fill the horizon with many more women than we thought was possible, and counteract the myth of the solitary, outstanding one, the exceptional case. I think whatever stories about women in Buddhism we find, they need to be told. We need a culture of confidence for women and men, that it is not a question if women can awaken or evolve in the best possible manner, benefiting others. It is the question should rather be how women can be promoted in their confidence to do so. We live in a world made out of stories, don't we? And how and what we narrate shapes our lives. This is true on all kinds of levels, personal, cultural, spiritual. And getting the stories of the female practitioners and awakened ones out in the open makes us see a more complete image of the whole Buddhist world. Well, yes, the stories of the Buddhist past do sound fantastic at times, more like legends than actual facts. But the people who heard them over the centuries and transmitted them found it by all means plausible that women like that could have lived and done what their stories tell about them. And this is also a very powerful indication about what might be the truthful truth of those stories. The public face of Buddhism is still mostly male, especially when we look in the higher ranks of the institutional hierarchy. Women have always and everywhere had better possibilities to thrive and evolve in not or only slightly institutionalized contexts. Like, for instance, at the beginning of the Buddhist order, at the times of the Buddha, everything was just forming, quite open. There were not so many rules as there were later. At that time, many of the women practitioners also lived as forest renunciates, quite free in the forests alone. Or even in the times of the Queen Srimala, where the lay movement caught momentum. And in our times now, in the West, because the Buddhism just only came to the West quite recently, and there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of things going on. It's not so clear how Western Buddhism is going to shape itself. Though Buddhists had been present before the 1960s and 1970s, these decades saw the influx of many Asian Buddhist teachers and large numbers of European and American converts to Buddhism. These years also marked the emergence of the second wave of feminism. So both happened together. Many women who were attracted to Buddhism were also involved with gender questions. And they were not about to play a secondary supportive role to enable men to study and practice while they provided domestic services. These women insisted that if study and practice were good for men, they were also good for women. And they took up these disciplines enthusiastically. This coincidence, this lucky timing, has forever changed the face of Western Buddhism and has an impact on Buddhism worldwide. Yes, Buddhism has been quite disadvantageous to women at times, and yet Buddhism can provide freedom, dignity, and peace to women. It all depends on how Buddhism is practiced, and much of that depends on the initiative, courage, and imagination of women practitioners. The pioneers of this movement have done a lot for us, have shown us what could be possible. And at the end of my talk, I would like to show you the faces of some of them, of those female Buddhist pioneer teachers, and call them by their names. So, if you would like to. So, we have here in the big image, this is Lama Shenpen Hookham, and she's here in person. She lives quite nearby on the peninsula and at the Hermitage of the Awakened Heart. And she is a teacher, a leader of our community. She's a meditator and a scholar. She wrote a thesis about the essence of what Queen Srimala really talked about. And then there is right above, this is Sylvia Wetzel. She is my German Buddhist teacher. She introduced me to Buddhatara. And at the first conference of Western Buddhist teachers with the Dalai Lama, 1993, she invited the audience to the following experiment. Imagine that you are a young man and interested in Buddhist practice, and you enter the temple, and all the imagery is female, powerful and strong. And then you advance to the throne, and on the throne sits a hugely impressive, wise woman. How would you, as a young student male, feel? And it is said that the Dalai Lama was quite impressed with this. Then we have below, it's another German teacher. She's already dead, Ayya Khema. She was a Jewish German lady, and she was one of, I think she was the first nun who got back the full ordination. And she came back to Germany and established Buddhist centers there. Then, if you could take the next one. This is Lama Tsultrim Allione. She's an American lady teacher of Buddhism. Hers was the first seminal work, the Women of Wisdom. And next to her we see Dipha Ma. She's also already dead. An Indian lady. She lived in the 20th century. She was a widow and single mother, and taught the housewives in her part of Calcutta where she lived to meditate and really get highly accomplished in meditation. Then some Western Buddhist seekers found her, and they flocked into her tiny apartment in Calcutta to learn from her. Next one, please. On the left, Jetsun Ma Tenzin Palmo. She's an English lady. You wouldn't think, or would you? I mean, maybe her face is giving her away. She lived for 12 years in her Buddhist training in the Himalayas in a cave. And there's a book that describes that. It's called A Cave in the Snow. So it's very readable and very interesting. And then above, this very nice lady with a skeleton. Her name is, and she's also already dead, Ruth Denison. She was a German lady who emigrated to America and got into teaching Buddhism there. And you see, she happily embraced impermanence. And it is said that she led the first female retreat in America, all-female retreat, only for women. And last but not least, Jetsun Khandro. She's one of the rare, really rare Tibetan Buddhist female teachers. And she's quite outspoken. She speaks perfect English. And she is quite outspoken about the reason why there were so few eminent women in Buddhism. She says it's due to a lack of education by a patriarchal system like the Tibetan. And what does a patriarchal system do? It limits the possibilities for women. And she says it's necessary to be independent and at the same time sustained by a culture to gain realization, insight, and awakening. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't make it too long. Thank you. Yes, I think I talked a little bit longer than I was supposed to, so I hope you didn't go to sleep. Oh yes, I would. Or comments or whatever you feel you want to add or just express at that point.
While you're wondering what you want to ask, I think I should show you the very last thing.
Yeah. This is Buddha Prajna Paramita. She's the wisdom that leads us beyond suffering. And you can see she's female. And she holds a text that is describing what this wisdom is, and a symbol that's called a vajra, which is the undestructibility. And we can see that's also a path of meditation. Her lower arms are in the mudra, the gesture of meditation. In this form, and in this form, it's the mudra of the gesture of teaching. So I find this very powerful that it's a female figure in a Buddhist context. Yes, did anything strike you as interesting in what I said, or did you find, that you recalled something from your own experience? Or anything you would like to know about me or whatever? Now's the time.
Maybe I can start with a question.
Oh, yeah.
Would you say that in Western culture, is there any particular difference between countries like Germany or Britain or America in terms of women practicing Buddhism? Do you see any difference there? Or is it like quite same across the Western world?
Well, I'm not sure if I know, but what I find interesting is that when you look at the Buddhist centers in the West, you find a lot of women studying there, meditating, and there are many, many women attracted to Buddhist practice. And then it's very sad to see that there are many women in the room and on the throne or in the teaching position is a man. So, and I think, well, what I really observe is that this is changing, rapidly changing, and that we see many more female teachers in that position, which must indicate something, change of culture, change of confidence. And maybe also the women gaining confidence that they can move on the path, that they really are in a good position. So maybe that's the best I can say.
I've got a question. It might not be directly related to what you have been saying. Did Buddha say anything? Buddha's original teaching. Did he mention anything about wife's role? Wife's role in attaining spirituality alongside her husband, like that's what they do normally in Hinduism, possibly, So is there anything written in Buddha's, is there anything mentioned in Buddha's original teaching that wife can attain spirituality alongside her husband?
Alongside her husband?
Outside.
Out?
No, along together.
So when the husband practices, she goes along with him?
Yeah,
or?
and influence.
Influence.
Because women used to be barred from attaining spirituality, whether she could do in Buddhist teaching, do together.
Well, why not? I don't see why not. Yeah, well, I think it's good to help each other, and I think the Buddha would approve. But I don't know anything specific about couples moving on what the Buddha said. I mean, there's in the later development of Buddhism, we get teachings about how couples practice together, but that's a different context. Please.
Could you say a few words about compassion?
Oh.
There was one point in your talk where I thought I understood you to be saying that compassion was something that an enlightened person needed to overcome.
No.
I misunderstood.
No. Passion, you overcome passion and attachment, but not compassion. You need to have as much compassion as you can. Remember, Tara got enlightened and got to be Buddha Tara because she was so proficient in her practice of infinite compassion. That made her become a Buddha. Yeah. Yeah. Please.
I just wondered if you could say a bit more about the comment that Sandra was making about the relationship how you should relate to, or could relate to your culture. But you said something about being independent, and I just wondered kind of what that meant.
So she had this both sides. On the one hand, you should be independent. You need to be independent to find your own answers, to be in retreat and to be really independent in a way where you find what is true for yourself. You find it in yourself. Yes. And on the other hand, you need to be sustained by a culture in doing so. Because if the culture, the society doesn't promote this, which has happened with the women for many, many centuries, then you don't have enough confidence to do that. And it's not something, where you are, where you're promoted or sustained or supported. And she feels that both aspects have to work together. Yes, and maybe we sometimes in the Western culture, we get this a little bit when we are not too sure to whom we can talk about, if we are Buddhists or if we are meditating, to whom we can talk about this, because people might find this strange. So we are not sure if we are supported by the society on a spiritual path, or if society is very critical towards that and thinks it's one of those things that women do. But I think it's changing. It's people see that this is a very thorough path and compassionate path. Yeah. Please.
So would you say that the lack of women being obvious in Buddhism is more to do with the cultural acceptance of them than them not being accepted in the religion?
Well, you can't really separate those two out, because the culture provides how the religion is practiced, what kind of form it takes, and if it's an all-male context, and the only way to progress is that you're entering a monastery and it's a monk's monastery, by gender you are excluded. So this goes hand in hand, doesn't it? Yeah.
But still, there's nothing doctrinally to support it.
No. As I said, the Buddha said, yes, women can awaken, no problem. And the interesting thing is that it tends to get forgotten, So there must be huge cultural impacts that sort of cover this whole thing and make it go down. Because that's what the Buddha said. The Buddha said, no problem, they can awaken. That's why I find this story so fishy, that he refused 3 times Prajapati to establish the order. It sounds strange. But there you are, she didn't take a no. Yeah. I find it very affirmative and encouraging that the Buddha said, well, women can just in the same way awaken as men can. And I find this very encouraging. Yeah.
And you didn't mention about Kandra Rinpoche, but she's actually head of a very major monastery of monks. And she says she feels sorry for her monks. They're not used to being bossed around by a woman.
Did you get that in the back? Yeah. Well, I think it's a good thing for them to learn. Please.
I just have a comment actually. Well, it's a comment and a question, because when I was working with Tibetan refugees in the 90s in a hospital, I was struck because one of the doctors, a Tibetan doctor, about my age, was quite open in his understanding that women could not become enlightened, and this is not that long ago.
Yeah.
But it's still quite pervasive, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
He said the best thing you could hope for is to be reborn as a man. If you're really good.
Yes, it's quite strong in the cultural kind of strand there. Yeah. But I remember when I started out in Buddhism in the early 90s, a Western man saying to me, you know, well, the Buddha was a man, and I'm really sorry to say that, but it's really, you know, it must indicate that men are more, are more able to awaken than women. He said that to me. It was the 20th century. I was quite puzzled. Yeah. So, yeah, please.
I have a question about, is your talk similar to your book?
Yes.
So, does your book use the research, does contain all the research about these women? And how did you manage to find all this if it's so difficult?
Well, you have to be very thorough. Yes. And I was really, only for my own practice that when I began, I didn't think of writing a book. I just wanted to, you know, fill up the gap, the hole that I felt behind me. And I thought, it's not right. There must be women. They must be there. And it's interesting because at that time in the 90s, the research started also in America and in other parts. And yes, till then, many studies have been published on women in Buddhism, on specific female figures. Manuscripts have been discovered. It's always interesting. You find things that you really want to find. So, there we are.
Well done.
Do you want to comment?